So I played through that new God of War Ragnarok DLC, Valhalla. I did it a little bit later than I would have liked, but what can I say, I was busy. To give my brief thoughts on that, I think it was fantastic. I would have never expected a rogue-lite God of War style game to work, but it absolutely did. If you haven't played it, essentially Kratos is invited to Valhalla by an unknown person to fight in their hallowed halls for reasons that I will get into in a minute. Essentially, it's a trial by combat where death and resurrection is integrated into the design, as Valhalla will revive you if you die in combat. You go through various landscapes modeled after various memories within Kratos, and it alternates between safe in-between areas where you can stock up on various things, find collectibles, get some dialogue to push the story forward, and pick which portal to go through next, which will determine which reward you get for the next battle. Then of course there are the battles, which are essentially randomly selected assortments of enemies from throughout the series, and every option for upgrades you get are also completely randomly assigned so that you get a different series of buffs and debuffs for every run, hopefully so you can find one that works with your playstyle, letting you dominate. For example, at one point I found several buffs in a row that upgraded the Flame Whiplash to the point that I could essentially induce the burning status effect with a single charged attack, which was a real satisfying attack to use at that point. The random rolls forces you out of your comfort zone, which the base game doesn't really do. In fact, it even rewards you for trying different things. But it didn't help me with the final boss of the DLC, which is one of the harder bosses in the entire history of the series. If you die, you start over and can use several different currencies to level up Kratos and make the next attempt easier, hence the roguelite designation. As you progress through Valhalla, you occasionally get spat out and have to start again, which progresses the story of the DLC. And every time you go in, you get a little bit more context about Kratos and his ultimate decision. That's about as much as I can say without spoiling, but I will say that this mode is really fun. And I thought it would get repetitive, but the random rolls you get for the equipment and the abilities keeps the gameplay surprisingly fresh even if you're going through the same or similar environments try after try, and really, you're only going through them try after try if you're failing. Essentially, this DLC is a distillation of all my favorite parts of God of War Ragnarok into a single package tied together with a really good story. So if you liked Ragnarok, you'll love the Valhalla DLC. But one thing that's definitely worth noting is how it essentially puts a cap on the entire story arc of the modern God of War games. And for me is the final definitive proof that Santa Monica does actually care about classic God of War. Because when God of War 2018 came out, it was somewhat of a hard left turn, so it became an ongoing and somewhat asinine discussion as to whether or not Santa Monica Studios were ashamed of the previous iteration of God of War, or if the Greek saga was something worth being ashamed of. Perpetuated by completely ignorant game journalists, and I will say what I've said a million times, games journalism is the corpse that keeps on twitching. I will admit shamefully that I took part in this discussion for a time. I believed they didn't care for a while, but that was during a period of time before I'd actually played 2018, and imagine this, I learned to appreciate the game as soon as I played it, which kind of plays into my theory that most games criticism comes from people who don't actually have any context for what they're criticizing, or all their context is secondhand. Or to put that in another way, The Last of Us Part 2. I would say that for the first half of the game, you wouldn't be mistaken in thinking that they were doing everything they could to bury the past. But I thought that kind of went out the window the moment the Blades of Chaos were brought out in the most emotional fanfare possibly in the entire history of the series. I feel like with 2018, there's sort of a disconnect between author intention and story context, because I don't think it's necessarily that Santa Monica Studios were ashamed of the past games or didn't want to acknowledge them, it was that Kratos himself was ashamed of it. It was him trying to bury the past as best he could, protecting himself, his son, and the people around him from the knowledge of his past. Now, I'm the #1 proprietor of the idea that God of War didn't grow up so much as it shifted focus, because Kratos was always a deep character. It's just that you didn't have the dialogue to really establish who he was in the early games, because it was also a series of solo adventures. You had to infer through context clues who he was, what his motivations were, where his mindset was, and so on. The original series was, in hindsight at least, an exploration into how destructive abuse, trauma, and unchecked anger can be. No amount of gratuitous violence or 3D titties is ever going to downplay that for me. It kind of occupied a weird nether space where if you simply wanted a macho power fantasy where you rip and tear, it provided that, but to the people who were willing to look into things a bit deeper, it did have at times deceptively deep storytelling. With that said, they did kind of downplay the macho power fantasy element by making the games overtly less violent and sexy. And with so much more story and dialogue, you can no longer ignore these aspects of characterization, but they were always there. And to the point I was making a minute ago, when you have a man essentially cause death and destruction on what was thought to be an impossible scale and only realizes what he's done as soon as the smoke is cleared, where do you take that character next? Because really, I think there's only two directions you can take them. Keep things going the same, or address how something like that might affect someone. Have them be a more cut-off character and showcase a more introspective, depressive look at how a person copes with the shame of their past. And the former, I feel, probably would have been a bad choice, because I feel as though, as great as the Greek saga was, the formula was really starting to wear thin by the end. So having him destroy more pantheons would have been hard to justify first of all, and would have also been immediately tiresome. So from a storytelling perspective, taking the series in this direction wasn't the smart choice, it was the only choice. Unless they wanted to stop the series altogether. And right off the bat, it shows that these games are a direct logical answer to the original series and not something that tries to exist in spite of it. So right from the beginning, you get the sense that they did care about the direction of the series insofar as they wanted to give greater meaning to the old games via a new storyline that felt like a natural progression of the concept. You had to downplay the elements of the previous games in order to sell the importance of said elements as soon as they did pop up. How important it is that Kratos masks the truth, how important it is that he keeps the Blades of Chaos nearby but never uses them. And all these elements were only improved upon in Ragnarok. The character progression felt like a natural elevation from Kratos' relationship with his son as well as the people around him, all the ways they implement contextually relevant fan service, and so on. These are all topics I've covered in the past, and I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but basically I feel as though from the beginning they were acknowledging the past games as best as they could without making something derivative or asinine. Or to put that in another way, Sonic Frontiers. And then came the Valhalla DLC, which honestly blew away all my expectations. It's the final story beat in the tale of Kratos forgiving himself. In 2018, he was able to open up, and in Ragnarok, he chose to let the Ghost of Sparta go and chose to be better whatever the cost may be, and now in the Valhalla DLC, he must choose whether or not he wants to be a god of a new age. You see, Freya has decided that with Odin gone, that the realms need more noble leadership, so she's asked Kratos to join the ranks of the Norse pantheon. However, Kratos is indecisive because he still fears his own godhood. He's still afraid of history repeating itself. The last time he took a godly throne, it was a decision that everyone suffered for. So he's invited to Valhalla by a mystery person who ends up being Tyr, and in Valhalla he will face his past and clear his head so that he may make his decision more clearly.
Because for us, fighting occupies the body while our minds work out the rest. Because you're not ready.
I didn't quite know what this DLC was going for when I first heard about it, and so I watched a friend of mine play through the first couple rounds. Then the moment I saw Kratos' old throne, I knew I couldn't spoil anything else for myself, and it was shortly after that point when I realized exactly what this DLC was attempting to do. It's basically exposure therapy, confronting Kratos with all his past actions, and they do so in both a positive and negative fashion. One of the big surprises of this DLC was Helios showing up to occasionally replace Mimir.
Can't muster up so much as hello for one of your most auspicious victims?
Hello, Helios.
That right there is an almost on-the-nose representation of the angel and the devil on your shoulders, because Helios is extremely cold and confrontational with Kratos. Obviously, Kratos ripped Helios' head off with his bare hands, but it's not actually Helios. He's just a personification of Kratos' own self-doubt, characterized by one of his coldest deeds, which just so happens to be a parallel with Mimir. The entirety of Valhalla is a personal experience built by Kratos' memories, and the fact that it's not actually Helios could probably explain why his dialogue is so much less poetic than the dialogue usually was in the Greek saga.
I hate to disappoint you, you blithering idiot. But you do remember I'm a sun god, right? You think I'm afraid of a little fire? You will never defeat Zeus, Spartan. You will forfeit your life in trying.
But the fact is, the entire time you're constantly facing new enemies that are actually returning old enemies, fighting through familiar environments, in particular the Chamber of Sacrifice, where we had to burn a living person to death in order to progress, and we're constantly getting dialogue about the past events that led us to this point. I was trying to play this game on medium difficulty, and I managed to mostly make it through right up until the final boss with Tyr. He is an absolute pain in the dick in his final form. I ended up failing that boss like 9 times before finally throwing in the towel and dropping down a difficulty level. But I'm kind of glad that happened because it gave me the opportunity to get all 3 pieces of the story attached to a couple of story items. Though I kind of wish that Kratos giving his perspective on the story attached to those items would have started earlier. I don't know about you guys, but I don't care about Mimir's would-be romance with Sigrun. Also, why they started with the ship captain story is a mystery to me. I know it's a running joke in the series, but the story of Calliope in Elysium probably should have been the first one they told. But that story of Calliope in Elysium being told was a surprise to me because that's somewhat of a deep cut in my opinion, even more so than when they referenced Ghost of Sparta in Ragnarok. But that heartbreaking moment in Chains of Olympus almost seemed to exist in a vacuum up until now. Hell, they even have an extended story point dedicated to God of War Ascension and the physical embodiment of the oath that Kratos took towards Ares. I don't even particularly like Ascension, but the fact that they referenced it at all was pretty cool. The only deeper cut they could have referenced at this point would be God of War Betrayal. This entire part of the game is just filled with imagery and references to past games. And when it comes to the story progressing naturally, they don't stop at simply having Kratos' throne and having Helios replace Mimir. They even bring back the Blade of Olympus as an alternate rage attack, and if you didn't mark out for that moment, you may not have a soul. So it gets to the point that you're going through this wondering what they're going to bring out next, and since this is an introspective look at the history of Kratos, it all feels relevant. Tyr is essentially the MC helping Kratos through his struggle, and every time we make it through, they take a bit of God of War history and use that to further the story. And in some of these cases, it's pure vindication because they go out of their way to explain that the entire history of Kratos is much more complicated than one might be led to believe. He was capable of doing good and even sacrificing himself for the greater good, and the abuse he suffered was the catalyst for his eventual downfall, or as Tyr puts it,
What is the point?
That your legacy has always been a complicated one. That goodness is not a destination we arrive at, but a practice. Misfortune may drive anyone to darkness. We resist it only through wisdom and vigilance.
But then there comes the times when they recontextualized past events in ways that I would have never even thought about. The most noteworthy of which is when they confronted Kratos with the day he made his pledge to Ares. Essentially, the beginning of the end. Tyr poses the idea that Kratos can't blame himself for what came after because there was no possible way he could have understood the implications of pledging himself to Ares like this. Kratos saw this as nothing more than a solution to a problem in the immediate future. He was vastly outnumbered and on the verge of being killed. And had his army not held the line here, thousands more would have died or worse as the barbarians advanced. Like, hot damn, that's something I would have never even considered because I, and I'm sure many other people, sort of just take this moment for granted. That was the part that stuck out to me the most, but there's a lot of different instances of Kratos having to face his past and master himself before coming to his decision. And tragically, it's also showcased that he still has a little bit of that dog left in him, such as in the moment where Helios shows up and Kratos' first instinct is to sacrifice him to the flames of the Chamber of Sacrifice, which almost results in the permanent death of Kratos himself and Mimir. There is so much potent storytelling here, but none more so than the very end, when Kratos is finally able to confront the thing that he felt he could never confront, himself. Wow, classic Kratos in HD does look a bit cursed. Also, not getting TC Carson to at least record a little bit of dialogue did make the silence a bit awkward. But this monologue, when Kratos is finally able to face himself, is some of the best written dialogue in the history of the series.
You lost everything. And everyone. You became... There is no forgiving you. You chose! I chose. You are cruel and arrogant and selfish. But you are more than that. You have always been more than what others saw.
It's beautiful to have him be able to finally see that despite all his past misdeeds and trauma, and possibly being the least qualified person to be the embodiment of war at that period of time, he's still able to come to terms with the fact that there was always good within him. He acknowledges his past self as a horrible, brutal person. He may always have the potential to do harm and isn't completely convinced that he's not one more bad day from becoming that same god that he used to be, but he has hope. Hope that he can be better, and that he can be the god that these people deserve. To serve, not to be served. Pretty much making him simultaneously the god of war and the god of hope, which ties into that plotline in God of War 3 about him being the embodiment of hope. That is worthy of a full-on applause. It's amazing how every time I think the series has gone full circle, they find a little bit more circle to circle. The only thing I feel that would have made this a bit better is if they would have made you fight a mirror match with young Kratos. The final cap on phasing his past, although that may have gone against the spirit of this ending. And all that to me is proof that the God of War creators get God of War better than any fan ever could, because the impeccable storytelling, the recontextualization of the past games, and the fan service, to me all this is proof that the people at Santa Monica not only get God of War but also love and respect its history. Assuming the previous games didn't already prove that to you. I've had multiple people tell me that my original video about the one thing that everyone gets wrong about Kratos feels like a direct inspiration for the Valhalla DLC. And like I said, this is vindication for me because this is stuff I've been saying for years. I could easily joke around and say that Orion Walker saw my video and suddenly came to an epiphany, then that was the basis for the Valhalla DLC, but no, that's ridiculous. I don't think there was ever an obvious place to take the God of War series after Ragnarok ended, but if you wanted to tell the story of Kratos having insecurities over joining a new pantheon, this is pretty much the best way to take the story for anyone who knows half a lick about God of War. And from there, it's mostly just a test on how deep, how knowledgeable, and how detailed you can get with it, and this was simple but deceptively deep. If you already don't like modern God of War, it's not going to sell you on the idea, and that's fine, it's not for everyone, but I feel like the universal truth of fictional works is that we don't get to decide what is and isn't a good direction to take the IP. Succeed or fail, the direction of an intellectual property is based on the whims of whoever is currently in charge of the property and nothing else. There are some inherent restrictions that will vary from property to property, but there's no way to say if specific directions will work for specific people until you take them. Overall, I'm glad that the Norse games have turned out the way they have, and if this is the end for them, then I'm satisfied, as both a fan of new God of War and of old school God of War. That's all I've got. If you like what I do here and want to support the channel, you can like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support me in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, exclusive content, and Discord benefits, along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Billy Not Brooklyn, Dick Kickham, Gaw004, Knob Varley, Patchwork, Raaf, TyTrovy, and WeirdWebbster for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends. Ain't it funny how Kratos' topless armor option is called the Glory of Sparta? Like, damn right, you see these tits? These are the glory of Sparta.